Have you ever wondered who the Canaanites really were and what the true story was behind their conflict with Israel? For many centuries, the Canaanites ruled over the region we now call the Levant, a land filled with mysteries, wars, and a deep devotion to their gods. These gods were seen by many as frightening and even monstrous. In the Bible, the struggle between the Israelites and the Canaanites wasn't just about conquering territory. It was also a spiritual battle, a fight for the heart and soul of the people of Israel. The Canaanites worshipped many gods, and their rituals often included violent ceremonies and sacrifices that shocked those around them. But who were these gods? Why were their worship practices so brutal and so different from the faith of Israel? In this video, we'll uncover the remarkable history of the Canaanites, explore their main deities, and see how their religion stood at the center of their conflict with Israel. We'll talk about Baal, Ashtart, and other ancient gods whose presence influenced the battles for the Promised Land. The war between Israel and Canaan was not just fought with weapons. It was a clash of faiths, where beliefs determined the destiny of entire nations. Get ready to journey into this ancient civilization to see how their gods shaped history and why their legacy still echoes in our world today. Who were the Canaanites, and what did their terrifying gods truly represent? Stay with us as we uncover the truth. The Canaanites were an ancient people who lived in the land that is now modern-day Palestine, long before the Israelites arrived. Their story is mainly told in the books of Genesis and Exodus, which reveal their origins and their early encounters with Israel. According to the Bible, the Canaanites were descendants of Canaan, the son of Ham, who was one of Noah's sons. Their story begins right after the Great Flood, when Noah, the righteous man who survived God's judgment, planted a vineyard. But after drinking from its wine, he became drunk and lay uncovered inside his tent. When Noah's son Ham entered his father's tent and saw him lying naked, instead of showing respect and covering him, he went out and told his brothers, Shem and Japheth, what he had seen. Hearing this, Shem and Japheth acted with honor. They took a cloak, walked backward so they wouldn't see their father's nakedness, and covered him carefully. When Noah woke up from his drunkenness and learned what had happened, he became furious. He pronounced a curse upon Ham's son, saying, "Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be to his brothers." Genesis 9:25. From that moment, the descendants of Canaan, known as the Canaanites, were marked by this curse. Their future would be tied to servitude and constant struggle with the descendants of Shem and Japheth, particularly the people of Israel. This became the first episode in a long and complicated relationship between the Canaanites and the Israelites. According to the Bible, the descendants of Canaan settled in the land of Canaan, which later became the land that God promised to give to Abraham's descendants. This region was inhabited by many nations, but the Canaanites were the strongest and most established among them. Over time, the Canaanites gained a reputation for their devotion to pagan gods and for performing dark, corrupt rituals. Their main deities were Baal and Ashtart, and their worship often involved cruel sacrifices and immoral acts, practices that went completely against the laws and values God had given to his people, the Israelites. Because of this, God, through Moses and later Joshua, commanded the Israelites to drive the Canaanites out of their lands. This wasn't just about claiming territory, it was a spiritual mission. The Canaanites' religious customs were seen as deeply corrupt, a twisting of God's divine plan. God did not want his chosen people to be drawn into those false practices. Therefore, the struggle between the Israelites and the Canaanites became much more than a war over land. It was a battle of faith, a direct confrontation between the God of Israel and the pagan gods who ruled the hearts of the Canaanites. This conflict did not just shape the conquest of Canaan. It helped define the very identity of Israel. For the Israelites, defeating the Canaanites was not only about claiming the promised land, but also about strengthening their faith. By overcoming those who worshipped false gods, they proved the supremacy of the one true God and renewed their commitment to pure, undefiled worship free from idolatry. At its core, this was a fight to protect the spiritual integrity of God's chosen people. The story of the Canaanites, as recorded in the Bible, is far more than the account of a nation's defeat. It represents a deep spiritual struggle, a choice between purity and corruption, between faithfulness to God and the temptations of pagan practices. The Israelites' victory over the Canaanites became a turning point, not just in their history, but in the formation of their divine identity. They were called to stand apart, to resist idolatry, and to keep their covenant with the Creator unbroken. This confrontation came at a crucial moment, right after the Exodus from Egypt, when under Joshua's leadership, the Israelites began taking possession of the Promised Land. This defining event, detailed in the book of Joshua, fulfilled the promise God had made to Abraham centuries earlier. According to that covenant, God swore that Abraham's descendants would inherit the land of Canaan as a lasting possession. This wasn't an empty promise. It was a divine commitment passed down from Abraham to his son Isaac, and then to Jacob, also called Israel, the father of the 12 tribes. Therefore, Israel's conquest of Canaan was much more than a military campaign. It was the visible proof of God's faithfulness, a living sign that His word, spoken to Abraham, was being fulfilled through history. The story of the conquest is not just about land, it's about faith, endurance, and devotion. It marks the rise of a people chosen to remain faithful to their God, resisting corruption, and carrying forward His divine purpose on earth. The Bible tells us that after the Israelites were freed from slavery in Egypt under the leadership of Moses, they spent 40 years wandering in the desert. During that time, God guided them, gave them His laws, and prepared a new generation to enter the Promised Land. However, it was under Joshua, the successor of Moses, that the Israelites finally crossed into Canaan, the land of the Canaanites. Their entry was not easy or peaceful. The land was already occupied by powerful nations, including the Canaanites, whose fortified cities and pagan gods stood as major obstacles. The Bible describes the conquest as a fierce and bloody struggle, filled with acts of courage and faith. Joshua, chosen by God to lead, commanded the Israelite army through many campaigns, from the famous fall of Jericho, where the city's walls collapsed after the Israelites marched around them for 7 days, to the capture of other important strongholds throughout the region. The conquest of Canaan is portrayed as an act of divine justice. The Canaanites, through their idolatry and corrupt practices, had turned away from the ways of the Lord. Because of this, God instructed the Israelites to destroy many Canaanite cities and drive out the inhabitants. Their practices, such as child sacrifices and the worship of gods like Baal and Asherah, were considered detestable before God. God repeatedly warned the Israelites not to form alliances or covenants with the Canaanites, so their faith would remain pure. The story of Canaan's conquest also emphasizes the importance of obedience. Joshua's absolute faith and obedience to God's commands were the reason for Israel's victories over the Canaanite nations. The Bible also cautions against being influenced by Canaanite customs, reminding the people that the fulfillment of God's promise depended on their continued faithfulness. Therefore, the conquest of Canaan was not just a military campaign, it was a spiritual journey. The Israelites faced not only enemies around them, but also struggles within, between faith and temptation, obedience and disobedience. In the end, victory in Canaan symbolized the triumph of the God of Israel over the false gods of the Canaanites, a declaration of the supremacy of faith in one true God over the idolatrous beliefs of a pagan world. The possession of the Promised Land was, therefore, the fulfillment of an everlasting covenant between God and the people of Israel. In contrast, the Canaanites were a people deeply rooted in polytheism, the belief in and worship of many gods and goddesses, each representing aspects of nature and the cosmos. Their religion was filled with intense spiritual rituals and ceremonies designed to please their deities and secure blessings such as fertile soil, good harvests, and prosperity. At the top of their pantheon stood El, the supreme god and creator of the universe. El was often portrayed as a wise and ancient figure, sometimes connected with a sacred oak tree, symbolizing his link to nature and divine strength. He was regarded as the father of all Canaanite gods, a being of peace and cosmic order, whose authority extended over all creation. Beside El was his wife Asherah, the goddess of fertility, nature, and abundance. She embodied the cycles of life, renewal, and vegetation, representing the earth's power to give and sustain life. To the Canaanites, Asherah was the source of the land's fruitfulness, ensuring crops would grow and the land would remain fertile. Her worship was closely connected to agricultural rhythms, and people held ceremonies and offerings in her honor to guarantee rich harvests. Many temples were built for her, where elaborate rituals were performed to celebrate her presence and influence on earth. However, the most popular and influential god in Canaanite worship was Baal. He was believed to be the god of rain, storms, and fertility, the one who controlled the weather and made the land fruitful. Without Baal's blessing, the rains would stop, crops would wither, and famine would follow. Baal was depicted as a mighty warrior, fighting against the forces of chaos to bring life-giving rains to the earth. His worship was tied closely to agriculture and the changing of the seasons. The Canaanites built grand temples in his honor, where people gathered for festivals filled with music, dancing, and sacrifices, all meant to win Baal's favor and ensure abundant harvests and prosperity for their people. Besides El, Asherah, and Baal, the Canaanites also worshipped many other lesser gods and goddesses, each tied to specific cities, regions, or aspects of life such as war, health, love, and prosperity. Every city had its own temples dedicated to these deities, where priests and priestesses led ceremonies, sacrifices, and prayers. Canaanite religion was diverse and fragmented, made up of numerous local cults and traditions, yet all shared one common belief that the gods had to be pleased through offerings and rituals to secure their favor and protection. Among the most shocking and extreme practices were human sacrifices. In times of crisis, such as drought, famine, or war, the Canaanites believed that offering human lives could appease the gods and restore blessings to the land. Children or prisoners of war were sometimes sacrificed, with the hope that such acts would bring rain, fertility, and prosperity. These brutal rituals were strongly condemned by the Israelites and many neighboring peoples, who viewed them as acts of horrific cruelty. Another disturbing element of Canaanite worship involved fertility rituals, which often included sexual acts performed within temples. The Canaanites believed these sacred sexual practices would awaken divine fertility, ensuring abundant harvests and the renewal of life. For them, sexuality was not merely physical, it was a spiritual act, a way to work together with the gods to bring life and prosperity to the earth. However, to the Israelites, these rituals were seen as deeply immoral and offensive. They stood in direct opposition to the holiness and purity that God required of his people. In Israel's eyes, the gods of Canaan were not true deities, but idols, man-made figures worshipped by a people who had turned away from the one true God. The Bible repeatedly describes these Canaanite practices as idolatry that corrupted hearts and minds, drawing people away from real faith. The promised land given to Abraham and his descendants was meant to be a place of spiritual purity, free from the influence of pagan corruption. That is why, in his covenant with Israel, God commanded through Moses and Joshua that the Israelites not only avoid worshipping Canaanite gods, but also destroy their altars, idols, and temples scattered throughout the land. This destruction was not just about cleansing territory, it was about protecting the spiritual purity of God's people. Every Canaanite idol, shrine, and pagan altar was seen as a threat to Israel's faithfulness and loyalty to God. If the Israelites allowed themselves to be drawn into Canaanite idolatry, they risked breaking their relationship with God and losing his divine favor. The destruction of Canaanite altars and idols was therefore meant to protect them from the spiritual corruption that these pagan practices represented. By tearing down those sacred sites and eliminating false gods, the Israelites were making a public declaration of their dependence on the Lord and reaffirming their covenant commitment to him. Thus, the struggle for the Promised Land was much more than a battle for land. It was a spiritual war to keep Israel faithful to the one true God and free from the lure of idolatry that could destroy their identity and divine destiny. To the Israelites, Canaanite religion wasn't just a different belief system, it was a dangerous spiritual threat that had to be completely removed for God's plan to unfold. Their conquest of Canaan was both physical and spiritual, a fight for purity, faith, and loyalty in the face of moral and religious corruption. The book of Joshua and other biblical accounts highlight this repeatedly, showing that victory depended not just on military strength, but on obedience to God's commands and rejection of pagan influence. The conflict between the Israelites and Canaanites was intense and deeply symbolic. While the Israelites sought to fulfill God's promise by settling in the land He had given them, the Canaanites, with their polytheistic worship and immoral rituals, represented everything that threatened the holiness and faithfulness of God's chosen people. Therefore, the Israelites were not only fighting human armies, but also spiritual corruption. Their war was one of faith versus idolatry, a divine mission to preserve the truth of God's worship against the forces of pagan darkness and deception. For the Israelites, obedience to God's commands was the foundation of every success. Throughout the scriptures, God repeatedly instructs Joshua and the people to follow His commandments faithfully, promising that victory would be assured if they remained steadfast in His ways. The conquest of Canaan was therefore both the fulfillment of a divine promise and living proof that faithfulness brings God's blessing, while disobedience brings defeat, as seen in the tragic loss at Ai when the Israelites failed to follow God's directions completely. The Canaanites, on the other hand, played a major role in shaping the spiritual landscape of biblical history. Their religion, centered on gods such as Baal, Asherah, and others, stood in sharp contrast to the Israelites' belief in one true God. While the Canaanites practiced fertility rituals, human sacrifices, and acts of immorality in the name of their gods, the Israelites were called to worship Jehovah alone, who would guide and protect them in every situation. Maintaining the purity of this faith was essential. It ensured that Israel would not fall into the same idolatrous traps that had led other nations to ruin. In the end, the conquest of Canaan was not just a military victory, it was a spiritual triumph. It marked the fulfillment of God's promises to Abraham and his descendants, and the land they claimed became a lasting symbol of the covenant between God and His chosen people. At the same time, this story served as a powerful reminder of the dangers of idolatry and disobedience, warning future generations to remain faithful to God's commands. Thus, the conquest of Canaan remains one of the most significant events in the Old Testament, revealing not only a chapter of history, but the deeper truth about the relationship between God and His people, a relationship built on faith, obedience, and divine purpose. If you enjoyed this message, remember to subscribe to our channel for more content exploring biblical history, ancient faith, and spiritual insight. God bless you all. See you soon.